Well, thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. And before I start, I just want to actually take a shout out to all of the folks from Canada here. As you can tell from my accent, I'm actually a Newfie, or at least I spent a couple years there in my youth, and all of the actual real accents here really reminds me of that, and it was a great time to spend childhood in St. John's. And so maybe, well, I guess you won't have a conference like this out there, but it's great to get out there. One of my favorite books is A Tale of Two Cities. And so let me start by just talking about two cities and their different approaches to resilience. I'm not going to talk about Paris and London. I'm going to talk about Houston, Texas, and Santa Monica, California. So, Houston, Texas, back in the 1940s, was a city of about 400,000 people. So it was relatively large at the time. But the city planners, in their wisdom, knowing that they were subject to flooding caused by precipitation and caused by hurricanes, built two very large reservoirs outside the city. And those reservoirs were essentially really large detention ponds that were normally dry, but when a flood hit, water would flow into those reservoirs and protect the main city. And that was forward thinking, certainly at the time. But about 20 years later, the city leaders at that time decided that economic growth was more important for Houston. And Houston and the area around it began to grow by leaps and bounds. And today, the Houston area has over 6 million people. It's as big as Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and Philadelphia combined. Okay? And it really is an economic powerhouse in the South. It's one of the largest cities in the country. But in order to do that expansion, they had to continue to build businesses and houses anywhere they could, including in and around those reservoirs. Right? They hadn't had a big damaging flood, and developers kept pushing to find places to build affordable housing and new communities and new businesses, and the zoning laws in Houston were relatively lax, so a lot of those, two of those reservoirs kind of got filled up. Well, what we saw just about a year ago, it seems like longer, but August 25th, 2017, when Hurricane Harvey hit, was that, of course, where did that water go? It went into those reservoirs, and it caused over $125 billion worth of damage to the Houston area. And they're still recovering. It's going to take many years to recover, just like Superstorm Sandy, just like Hurricane Katrina. But when the New York Times interviewed the chief executive of Harris County, which is where Houston is located, he had the following comments. He said, resettling neighborhoods, making certain places off limits to development, creating dikes and reservoirs is difficult, both financially and politically. It takes longer than most election cycles. Memories fade, inertia sets in, residents just want to get their lives back to normal. Politicians want votes, not trouble. So that's a quote from the executive of Harris County. And so, what happened started in the what started in the 1940s as a very forward-looking, long-term plan to protect the residents of Houston, over the intervening 70 years was forgotten as generation after generation of civic and business leaders ignored what was going to come eventually. And of course, many will argue that Houston wouldn't be what it is today, an economic powerhouse, if it hadn't developed. But as I'll explain in a minute, there's a difference between leaders who focus on the immediate concerns, the chronic concerns of a region, and those that focus on the long-term acute stresses and acute shocks that may not even happen in their lifetimes. And so, with that, I want to transition over to the city of Santa Monica, California. So Santa Monica is a much smaller city. It's a beautiful little city nestled right next to Los Angeles on the coast in California. And when the Northridge earthquake hit in 1994, it certainly suffered a fair amount of damage. The city hall was damaged, other buildings in the city were damaged, but it avoided the most direct impacts of the earthquake. Nevertheless, the city leaders at the time decided that they were going to implement one of the nation's first retrofit ordinances for unreinforced masonry buildings, many of which you will see around town here. They said that we know eventually there's going to be an earthquake where we are going to be at the epicenter. And we have the most vulnerable types of buildings in the country here, unreinforced masonry buildings, at least when it comes to earthquakes. And so they implemented a requirement that business leaders, building owners, retrofit those buildings. There was a lot of pushback, but ultimately they were able to pass that ordinance. And recently, in 2017, just last year, they passed an even more expansive ordinance. Since the Northridge earthquake, engineers have learned a lot more about the performance of other types of buildings. Older steel frame buildings, soft story buildings where you have multi-story residential housing over garage units, okay, where the first story is very soft and can collapse. Older non-ductile concrete type buildings. And so Santa Monica became the first city in the nation to pass a comprehensive retrofit ordinance that would require over the next 20 years the retrofit of those types of buildings as well. Now, a quote from the mayor of Santa Monica sounds a little bit different than that from the chief executive of Harris County. The mayor said, "We want to do as much as we can to limit the loss of life and infrastructure, so in the event of a disaster, we bounce back strong." And that last term, bounce back strong, really is a great definition of what resilience is all about. Santa Monica couldn't pick itself up and move it to another part of the country where they don't have earthquakes. That wasn't an option, obviously. And so it knew that eventually it was going to be impacted by a natural disaster like an earthquake. And so its goal was not to completely avoid that, but to recover more quickly. And that's really what we mean when we think of resilience. Now, this wasn't an easy ordinance to pass either. It took several years. Because again, building owners and business owners were concerned about what the costs would be for them to retrofit many of these older buildings. But they were presented with a very simple question by the city council, by engineers that work for the city. They were basically asked, what would be the impact of losing your asset? Losing your investment. For most people and businesses, an investment in a building is the most significant asset they will have, or the most significant investment they'll ever make. What is the impact of losing that asset? And what is the impact on the community that you're a part of, that you live in, or you work in, or you rely on consumers to use your business or service? And when owners were educated about the impacts that an earthquake could really have on their buildings, they made the decision to support this ordinance that would eventually require many of them to retrofit their buildings, because it would preserve their investments more and it would preserve the community in which they lived and worked. So with those two cities kind of as a backdrop, let's talk a little bit about what resilience means, at least relative to how the U.S. Resiliency Council thinks of it. And I should say I really want to thank Bill Larson for inviting me, and Penwar for having me speak. Bill has been a great champion and supporter of the work we do, and really has a passion for resilience in the same way that the USRC does. And so, Bill, I want to say thank you very much to you, to Cal Portland, for being so supportive of the work we do. But what is the work that we do? So, there are a lot of different ways to define resilience. I really like the way that the mayor of Santa Monica sort of defined it in terms of bouncing back strong. I use the phrase, resilience is a measure of how quickly a system recovers from shock. Very simple, okay? It's not that you can avoid the shock altogether, okay? If we live in California, we can't avoid an earthquake. If you live in the Northwest, you can't avoid earthquakes even though they haven't happened for a long time. They will happen. You can't avoid wildfires and floods, right? Natural disasters are a part of our lives in most parts of the country, all right? But there are two types of shocks that we talk about when we talk about resilience. And this, to me, defines the difference between good leadership and great leadership. And that's really kind of the theme of my talk or my remarks today, is how to become great leaders when it comes to looking at resilience. The two types of shocks we talk about are the chronic stresses and the acute shocks. The chronic stresses are the things that we live with as a community, as a business, as a family, as individuals every day, right? A community has to live with affordable housing. Most parts of the West, at least, have a deep affordable housing chronic issue. Leaders of cities and counties and states are always looking at how, what's the economic health of their community. Business leaders, of course, look at that too. Those are always chronic things that they have to deal with every day. Homelessness, affordable housing, economic survival of their company or their community, the environment, power supplies. All of these things require leaders to make decisions that are not always popular in order to address these chronic stresses. And so lawmakers will implement policies to build more affordable housing. Business owners will invest in their employees to increase productivity. These are decisions that all leaders are expected to do. These were the decisions that the leaders in Houston from the 1960s up until today were also making. They were deciding that for the economic viability and health and future of their region, they needed to build more houses, more businesses. And so in some sense, you don't fault those kinds of decisions because that's what we elect leaders to do, or that's what we install CEOs to do. But the second part of resilience, the second kind of shock, is the one that really takes, I think, great leadership to think about as well. And those are the acute shocks. Those are the things that aren't necessarily going to happen every day. In fact, they may only happen once in your career or once in your lifetime, or they may not even happen in your lifetime. The Cascadia subduction zone earthquake that we all know is coming, the last time that happened was when Eric was a child, about 300 years ago, right? And so most of us will not be around when that earthquake actually happens, most likely. Nevertheless, somebody will be around, right? There will be people that will be affected by that, just like the floods in Houston, or hurricanes in Miami, or wildfires in the Northwest. These are things that are going to happen at some point, but the decisions that leaders make today may not come back and benefit them during their time in office, during their time as the head of a company. They may not come back to affect me during the time I own my house, making decisions to retrofit my own house. Well, if I'm going to sell it in 5 years, then why bother? But somebody's going to live in my house when that earthquake happens on the San Andreas Fault near San Francisco. And so, I think another one of my favorite books is Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. It's about the building of this cathedral in England, in this fictional town in England. And the building of this cathedral takes almost 100 years, okay? Can you imagine taking 100 years to build a building today? But the Duke or whoever it was that decided to build that cathedral, and the workers that laid the foundation and the architects that designed it, they never saw it completed. Okay? And their kids never saw it completed, and maybe their kids never saw it completed. It was only generations later that this church, this cathedral, was built and people got to enjoy it. But the leaders, when the decision was made to spend money and resources on starting this cathedral that none of the people at that time would get to enjoy, as opposed to spending that money on something else, like a water slide, back in the 1200s, was a decision that was hard to make, but it was long-term forward thinking. And so when we think of great leaders, they have traits that in a way are similar to what we respect about heroes, right? They are folks that make decisions that don't necessarily benefit themselves, that require sacrifice, that require long-term thinking. And so people ask me a lot when I speak, they say, well, who's the enemy here? You know, I mean, tell me which group is really stopping us from building more resiliently our communities and our buildings. Is it developers who, you know, build a building and then sell it and they just want to do it as cheap as possible? Is it community and civic leaders who are focused on sort of short-term, returns on what they do? Is it the public? What is it? Who is the enemy? Well, I don't think there really is one group that we would define as the enemy. Everybody has interests that they have to serve. The enemy, I think of when it comes to resilience, is short-term thinking. Okay? It's this inability to think beyond the next election cycle, the next set of quarterly profits, or frankly, even for myself at home, to think about, you know, well, would I rather take a vacation or would I rather, you know, go under my house and brace my cripple wall? You know, so we're all guilty of that to some extent. It's human nature. It's human nature to think about the present more than we think about the future. But ultimately, that's what prevents us from really implementing resilience in the long term for those acute shocks. And when you have cities like Houston or Miami or Northridge or eventually Portland and Seattle that are going to undergo these massive acute shocks that could devastate thousands or millions of people, it becomes important to find ways that we can demonstrate great leadership. So let me talk about the solutions that we see from the U.S. Resiliency Council's perspective on how to do that. I'll talk a little bit in a minute about how the USRC is really helping work with stakeholders and partners to promote resilience, but generally we break it down into a three-step process, okay? And I call that process fear plus hope and a plan, okay? The first step is fear. And I'm a structural engineer, so I typically kind of tell it the way it is. You know, I'm not going to sign off on a building that isn't built properly, or if I'm evaluating an older building, I'm going to tell it the way it is. If the building isn't going to perform well in an earthquake, if it's a death trap or a collapse hazard, you know, I'm going to let the owner know that. So I'm pretty good at instilling fear into people about things like earthquakes. And the best way to do that is to make sure that people understand that this is a when, not if situation, okay? It isn't a case that maybe someday the Cascadia subduction zone will rupture, all right? It is going to rupture, and it's going to cause massive ground shaking on the coast of California, Oregon, Washington, and inland, all right? It will happen. You will have wildfires here in the Northwest. There will be flooding in places that may not have seen flooding for the past 50 years. It will happen. Because the difference between having a when mentality and an if mentality is if really means on my watch, right? If you have an if mentality, what you're really saying is, will it happen while I'm in control, all right? While I'm mayor, while I'm CEO of the company, while I own this home. And what that does is it discounts the value of future generations. If you have a when mentality, it doesn't matter if it happens on your watch or not. It only matters that it's going to happen and it's going to affect somebody. You know, in evolutionary terms, there's this evolutionary concept of this circle of empathy. And the more evolved the species is, the larger that group is. You know, the least evolved creatures only care about themselves. And then you can go to, like, birds. You know, the mother bird will care about her chicks. You can have, you know, like lions and tigers, and they will have larger groups of you know, their what is it called, a pride of lions that can include dozens of animals. Chimpanzees have been known to work in groups of up to 100 and have empathy for members of that group. So humans, being the most evolved of all species, have the largest circle of empathy. And so, we often think of our communities or companies, even, with thousands of people, as potential circle of empathy, where we can care about how somebody in my city is living, how they're doing, even if I don't know them personally. But where that circle grows even farther, where we evolve even more, is to think not only about our community today, but to think about it in the future. So if I can care not only about Menlo Park, California, near where I live today, but think about the people that live in Menlo Park 20 years from now or 40 years from now, that's a sign that I'm thinking even beyond temporally, just my immediate circle. And so that's where we have to get to. That's the first thing. We have to have a win mentality, because it means that it doesn't matter if the earthquake happens 50 years from now when I'm finally dead and buried. Only that it's going to affect somebody, and I want to do what I can today to help prevent that. But fear alone isn't obviously enough to drive action. You have to have hope, right? So the second strategy that we talk about is hope. That there are solutions